Imagine taking in a theatrical show with your loved ones when sudden terror strikes. The men storming the stage are not actors. The man, barking orders, informs you that you should call your family and let them know you will never see them alive again. Suicide bombers enter the rear of the auditorium carrying guns. These individuals are ready to go beyond the blood and take you with them. On this episode of Beyond the Blood, we explore the Moscow theater hostage crisis.
Gilchrist County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I just shot my daughter and shot all my grandkids, and I'll be sitting on my step, and then when you get here, I'm going to shoot myself.
You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
You admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
All crimes have a motive. Go beyond the blood and discover the reasoning behind the darkest crimes in history.
On October 23rd, 2002, families and couples are taken in Moscow's first ever Broadway-style performance entitled Northeast at the Dubrovka Theatre. The play depicts and celebrates Russians who fought during World War II and features many armed characters. Northeast is a highly popular performance, and tonight is no different, with a sold-out crowd of 850 in attendance. Shortly after 9 p.m., 40 to 50 camouflage-clad Chechen rebels arrive at the theater, armed with assault rifles, and many of the females, wearing all black, could be seen wearing suicide vests. Those in attendance of Northeast had different reactions. Some in attendance fainted, some began to weep, and others still believed the storming of the stage by masked men was part of the show. When the hostage-takers fired their assault rifles into the ceiling, causing damage, there is no doubt these individuals were on a mission. All hope would be further lost when the terrorists attached explosives to the supporting beams of the theater. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 15 former republics broke free from the grip of Moscow and established their independence. The small and mostly Muslim state of Chechnya in the North Caucasus also demanded independence from Moscow. However, Chechnya is home to the critical energy pipelines that run from the Caspian Sea. Moscow refuses to grant Chechnya independence and thereby lose their valuable supply lines. Over the previous years, the Chechens waged two brutal wars against Russia, devastating their homeland. 200,000 Chechens are slaughtered, and almost as many are displaced as a result of the bloodshed against Russia. Chechen rebels still launch a guerrilla-style campaign of war against the Russians, motivated to win independence for their countrymen. The leader of those who stormed the theater is 25-year-old Movsar Barayev, a notorious rebel, and arguably the most wanted man in Russia. Barayev was born into a rebel family, and all he has known is a struggle against Moscow. He is a strong Islamic fundamentalist who demands that Chechnya become an Islamic republic. Barayev is suspected of having ties to Al-Qaeda, and was previously documented meeting with Al-Qaeda agents in the foothills of Chechnya. With the seizure of the theater, Barayev and his army of the 29th Division have taken the battle for Chechen independence to the heart of Moscow. Barayev had a few but specific demands: that Russian forces withdraw unconditionally from Chechen territory within 1 week. Barayev had no qualms about using the theater's patrons as collateral in his demands against the Russian military. The gunmen declared they were willing to die for their cause and released a videotape to the media in which part stated, quote, "Every nation has a right to their fate. Russia has taken away this right from the Chechens, and today we want to reclaim these rights, which Allah has given us. In the same way, He has given it to other nations. Allah has given us the right of freedom and the right to choose our destiny, and the Russian occupiers have flooded our land with our children's blood, and we have longed for a just solution. People are unaware of the innocent who are dying in Chechnya, the sheiks, the women, the children, and the weak ones, and therefore we have chosen this approach. This approach is for the freedom of the Chechen people, and there is no difference in where we die, and therefore we have decided to die here, in Moscow, and we will take with us the lives of hundreds of sinners. If we die, others will come and follow us, our brothers and sisters who are willing to sacrifice their lives in Allah's way to liberate their nation. Our nationalists have died, but people have said that they, the nationalists, are terrorists and criminals. But the truth is, Russia is the true criminal, End quote. The Kremlin, within a short time, informed the group that it would be unrealistic to expect the Russian military to withdraw its troops, armaments, and supply lines within a week. The Chechen rebels then demanded the Russian military withdraw from any part of Chechnya. This is suspected to possibly give Chechen rebels on the ground in the territory time to exploit the withdrawal for militaristic advantage. Additionally, Barayev demanded the termination of the use of artillery and airstrikes. Furthermore, the hostage takers wanted to halt what has been deemed as a mop-up operation, and that Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly announced he was actively striving towards an end to the war in Chechnya. When those trapped inside the theater called loved ones, they would in a voice of terror tell their loved ones the terrorists had grenades, mines, improvised explosive devices strapped to their persons, and bombs. The Chechens would use Arabic names, and women were clad in full burqas. These actions are somewhat unusual for the North Caucasus. Could this have been the first clue that these rebels were trained by Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups? The situation inside the theater began to crumble rather quickly. The Chechens did not trust the hostages to leave the auditorium, fearing they would escape. As a result, the orchestra pit was infamously used as a bathroom. Plus, with the terrorists now following mass media, they would become even more paranoid, and with it, their attitudes would fluctuate based on these reports. As you might imagine, the theater was quickly surrounded by Russian military, special forces, police, and armored vehicles. Russian authorities would quickly order special forces to install fiber optic cameras and speakers inside the theater. This would provide authorities with crucial information such as the number of attackers, placement of explosives, and the exact movement of the rebels inside the building. Crucially, this could provide the Russians with a possible weak link in Barayev's plan. Within hours of storming the theater, the Chechen terrorists released children, pregnant women, fellow Muslims, and those who produced a foreign passport. The Chechens seemed to have no qualms with foreign tourists, which numbered approximately 75 from countries including the United States, Australia, the Netherlands, and more. 6 hours into the siege, television crews depict a lone figure walking towards the theater. The figure is shown trying multiple doors leading inside the building before she finally gains entry. Moscow does not know who the individual is, but quickly determines it is a female who is acting on her own accord. Viewers watch in horror. Chechen guards would bring the woman to Barayev. Witnesses could hear the woman hurling insults at the terrorists, referring to them as clowns, and trying to provoke the hostages to leave. Barayev had enough of this lone figure, who he assumed must be a spy, as she was able to cross the highly militarized line. The rebels dragged the woman off and executed her, to the horror of those trapped hostages. The figure would eventually be identified as 26-year-old civilian Olga Romanova, who acted on her own. Despite an investigation, it is unknown how Romanova crossed the police line undetected. On October 24th, the siege enters its second day. The rebels have released some 15 children, but Moscow has yet to make any goodwill gestures and refuses to negotiate. This worries security services that this could anger the terrorists and lead to executions of innocent people inside. The Russians, from the outset, began to train to storm the building. However, the layout of the theater presents a unique obstacle. The corridor to the building is 98 feet, or 30 meters long, which could result in a bloody entry. Additionally, the forces would have to fight up a well-defended staircase before they could reach the hostages, all while at any moment bombs could demolish the entire theater, which could result in hundreds of deaths. The rebels continued to release hostages, including a feeble British citizen. Later, a woman and 3 children would be released. According to Russian security services, 39 hostages would be released on October 24th. However, one hostage would reiterate that the hostage takers would begin to take lives if their demands were not taken seriously. Russian authorities would interview all those released from the grasp of the terrorists. Through extensive interviews, they discovered that Barayev was the man in charge. No bombs would be detonated without his consent. Furthermore, it was revealed that the rebels' main motive in releasing hostages was that if any of the hostages died, the Russians would storm the building at once. The Russians now decide they need to separate Barayev from those who control the bombs throughout the theater. By doing this, Barayev could not give the order to detonate his most powerful weapon. The Russians, in an attempt to fool Barayev away from the bombs, offer him safe passage to a third country. Barayev is enraged. They believe he would flee from a fight with Moscow. While Barayev is speaking with security services, a Russian colonel, acting on his own, approaches the theater. For the second time, the Russian line is broken. However, a Chechen guard fires upon the colonel, who manages to escape. Eventually, a hot water pipe would lead to further tensions. A hot water pipe would burst and inflame the Chechens, who viewed it as a provocation. They demanded the pipe be fixed, which was causing extensive flooding inside the building. The Chechen rebels were not far off in their assumption that the Russians caused the damage on purpose. The Russians would later state they had used the pipe for surveillance purposes. On October 25th, the siege has now entered its third day. The Chechens would speak with several public figures, but continued to make demands to speak with a representative from the Kremlin, as anti-war protests grow outside the theater itself. After meeting with Putin, security services swore to the hostage takers they would spare their lives if they released the remaining hostages. The terrorists agreed. They would release an additional 75 hostages of foreign citizenship. The Chechens also released 15 Russian citizens, which included 8 children. The Red Cross would be allowed inside the theater to provide hot food, clothing, and medicine to the hostages. A journalist with NTV was granted access and spoke with Barayev, who stated, quote, "We have nothing to lose. We have already covered 2,000 kilometers by coming here. There is no way back. We have come to die. Our motto is freedom and paradise. We already have freedom, as we've come to Moscow. Now we want to be in paradise." End quote. Barayev directed this message personally at the Kremlin. Barayev further went on to state that he had not come to kill hostages or to fight the special forces because he had done enough of that in Chechnya. Barayev decided he would release 4 additional hostages before the end of the third day. But Barayev has now barely slept for 3 days. He is exhausted and highly stressed. Acute stress causes headaches and depression, making his ability to concentrate on simple tasks difficult, and he's having volatile mood swings. As dusk came, a man ran across the police line and managed to gain entry to the theater. For the third time, the Russian line was compromised. The man claimed he had a son inside the theater, but his son did not appear to be inside the theater, and he was shot and killed by the Chechens. A hostage inside the theater, 30-year-old Denis Gribkov, ran over the theater's chairs towards one of the female suicide bombers. A male rebel shot at Gribkov, missing him, but striking 2 other hostages, killing one with a shot to the head and severely wounding the other. Both of them would be removed from the theater soon after. Gribkov was removed from the auditorium by the rebels, but later he would be found dead as a result of gunshot wounds. October 26 would mark the 4th day of the siege and the use of the notorious unknown chemical agent by Russian special forces. Just before dawn, the rebels would drag the show's producer out of the auditorium and take him to Barayev in the theater's technical room. Barayev wanted the producer to turn on the theater's videos in order for him to watch the moment him and the rebels stormed the theater. Security services, realizing Barayev is now away from the auditorium and unable to give the command to detonate the explosives, decided now is the time to strike. Russian special forces wearing protective masks attach a special canister of gas to the theater's ventilation system. However, to properly administer gas is a complicated procedure. One must take into account an individual's body weight, height, age, size. However, the Russians have none of this information of those still trapped inside the auditorium. The Russians would later cite a shift in the mood in the auditorium to execute the use of the chemical agent, fearing mass death was imminent. Early that morning, the searchlights used to illuminate the theater were turned off. At first, the hostages and Chechens believed the fine mist of gas coming into the building was from a fire. However, it soon became apparent that the gas was being pumped into the building, and many mistakenly believed it as tear gas. Conflicting reports state that the gas came from under the stage or a specially created hole in the building. Russian services later said it was a fentanyl-based gas that was pumped directly into the theater's ventilation system. With the sight of gas being pumped into the building, hostages became panicked, and one even called a radio station, stating, quote, "It seems to us that the Russians have started something. Please, give us a chance. If you can do anything, please do. I don't know which gas it is, but I see the Chechens' reactions. They don't want our debts, and our officials want none of us to leave alive. I don't know. We see it. We feel it. We are breathing through our clothes. It began from outside. That's what our government has decided, that no one should leave from here alive." End quote. The rebels, believing they are under attack, fire randomly into the parking lot. Russian special forces do not return fire, but wait for the gas to overwhelm everyone in the theater. The gas works very quickly. As soon as one breathes it into their lungs, it will enter the bloodstream. The blood carries the drug to the brain, affecting the central nervous system, causing the victim to slip into unconsciousness. Special forces continue to wait to make sure not one rebel will be awake when they enter the theater, fearing they could blow it up. Suddenly, a hostage appears outside the building. Russian special forces fear that if a hostage is awake and manage to walk free from the building, that the hostage takers must be awake as well. The Russian special forces are ordered to wait a further 40 minutes before entering the building. With the gas having been pumped into the building over an hour ago, the Russian command gives the order to storm the theater. However, Barayev and his men are away from the gas above the auditorium as the Russians storm the building from every direction. Many Chechens who have not been affected by the gas fight back, but eventually are slaughtered by the Russian special forces. The Russians pay particular attention to the female suicide bombers who could still, if awake, detonate their bombs. Barayev and his men await the Russians for a final showdown as the special forces battle their way upstairs. Soon, Barayev is gunned down by the highly trained special forces who end Barayev's mission in one final bloody stand. The entire assault lasted 20 minutes and resulted in no Russian casualties. However, Barayev and all his soldiers lay dead. Soldiers quickly begin to evacuate the unconscious hostages, fearing a bomb could still detonate. Soon, the hostages, most of whom are unconscious, are being treated by medical staff on standby. However, hospitals and medical services are overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. All 40 terrorists would be killed in the rescue operation. 130 hostages would sadly die the day of the rescue operation, or in the days to come. Moscow's Health Committee chairman announced that all but one of the hostages killed in the raid had died of the effects of the unknown gas rather than from gunshot wounds. Health officials would list the official cause of death for all the hostages to be terrorism, resulting in heart attacks or physical ailments. 17 cast members and 2 children were among the dead. Foreign hostages have claimed the result of the deaths is directly related to the gas the Russian services pumped into the theater, and claim roughly 200 individuals died, not the 130 as reported by the Kremlin. In 2003, the United States designated the 3 groups who took part in the terrorist raid of the theater as terrorist organizations, describing them as violent, responsible for numerous acts of terrorism, and with links to the Al-Qaeda network. The U.S. statement also reaffirmed their support for a peaceful settlement to the Chechen conflict and urged Russia to pursue such a solution. Chechen military commander Shamil Bazayev posted a statement on his website claiming ultimate responsibility for the incident, resigning all official positions within the Chechen government, and promising new attacks. He also apologized to Chechnya's elected president and separatist leader for not informing him of the planned raid and asked him for forgiveness. Basayev defended the hostage-taking for giving, quote, all Russians a first-hand insight into all the charms of war unleashed by Russia and taking it back to where it originated from, end quote. Basayev continued, quote, next, my main goal will be destroying the enemy and exacting maximum damage, and the next time, those who come won't make any demands and they won't take any hostages, end quote. A series of suicide bombings aimed at civilian targets in Russia followed in 2003 and 2004. Russian President Vladimir Putin defended the scale and violence of the assault in a televised address later on the morning of October 26, stating the government had, quote, achieved the near impossible, saving hundreds of people, end quote, and that the rescue proved, quote, it is impossible to bring Russia to its knees, end quote. Putin released another televised statement saying, quote, Russia will respond with measures that are adequate to the threat to the Russian Federation, striking all the places where the terrorists themselves, the organizers of these crimes, and their ideological and financial inspirations are, I stress, wherever they may be located, end quote. President Putin was unhappy with the coverage of the hostage crisis by NTV, the last nationwide TV channel effectively independent of the government. In January 2003, the management of NTV was replaced, resulting in a profound effect on the channel's policies. The attack prompted Putin's government to tighten Russia's grip on Chechnya. On the 20th of October, 2 days after the crisis, he announced that unspecified, quote, measures adequate to the threat, end quote, would henceforth be taken in response to terrorist activity, with the reports of 30 fighters killed near the Chechen capital Grozny. The Russian Ministry of Defense canceled plans to reduce the 80,000 troop presence in the tiny breakaway republic. In early November, the Russian Duma, or Parliament, approved a broad array of anti-terrorism legislation ranging from far-reaching restrictions on media coverage of terrorism-related incidents to secret burials for killed terrorists. One lawmaker proposed wrapping terrorist corpses in pigskin, and another suggested carting them around the city with their legs dangling. Many in the Russian press and the international media warned that the death of so many hostages in the Special Forces rescue operation would severely damage President Putin's popularity. Shortly after the siege, the Russian president had record public approval rating. In December 2002, 83% of Russians reportedly declared themselves satisfied. The official investigation that the Moscow City Prosecutor's Office had been conducting for 3.5 years failed to provide positive information on the gas agent that killed the hostages, possible antidote to the agent, the number of hostages released by the operation, the number of militants who had seized the theater, with hostages claiming that they saw more than 50 militants, whereas only 40 hostage takers were in the building according to the official version, and the names of officials who made the decision about the assault. It was reported that the efforts to treat the victims were complicated because the Russian government refused to inform doctors what type of gas had been used. The agent is referred to as a gaseous substance. In other cases, it is referred to as an unidentified chemical substance. A German toxicology professor who examined several German hostages said that their blood and urine contained halothane, a once common substance which is now seldom used in the Western world, and that it was likely the gas had additional components. No one is quite sure the components that make up the gas the Russians would eventually use inside the theater. The Chechens were motivated by a sense of revenge for the destruction of their homeland. However, they were moved by a strong sense of independence, which runs deep in Chechen culture. It would appear, by all accounts, that though the Chechens understood they would not leave alive, they appeared willing to release their hostages to safety. The Russians, particularly Putin, appeared motivated not to be humiliated by the Chechens on a national stage. The Russians would never, and to this date, have not released Chechnya from their grips. Today, Chechnya is recovering from 2 devastating wars and continues to struggle with the guerrilla forces in the area. Could the Russians have avoided storming the theater? It is possible. Speaking with 7 years service in the U.S. Army and multiple deployments to combat zones, hostage situations are very difficult to handle. What I can and will say is that the rebels, although disgusting in their tactics, seem ready to release hostages. Remember, the Russians made no gestures of goodwill, with a long-standing policy of not negotiating with terrorists. Some peace and economic growth has returned to Chechnya. The U.S. State Department warns against travel to the North Caucasus to this date, stating the following, quote, "Do not travel to Chechnya or any other areas in the North Caucasus region. If you reside in these areas, depart immediately. U.S. government travel to the region is prohibited due to ongoing security concerns. The U.S. government has no ability to assist U.S. citizens in the North Caucasus region. There have been several kidnappings of foreigners and Russian citizens working with the media and non-governmental organizations in the region. For more information on this case, view the 2003 HBO broadcast Terror in Moscow, a documentary directed by Dan Reed. Interviews with hostages and footage taken inside and outside the theater during the crisis are shown in the documentary. Beyond the Blood is on Twitter, @BeyondBloodPC. We are now available on iTunes, Podbean, and Google Play. Coming soon to Stitcher Radio. I am grateful for the overwhelming interest in this podcast I created with bringing listeners forgotten or under-discussed crimes. I am always open to listener suggestions and feedback. In a celebration of Halloween on October 30th, Beyond the Blood will present our first unsolved mystery. 2 missing men at the hands of 1 police officer. What could be the reason to go beyond the blood? Please review our show on whatever platform you listen on. This is Beyond the Blood.